Ciudad Juarez sits on the edge of two worlds, just across the Rio Grande from El Paso, Texas. This Mexican border city has always been a place of contradictions, opportunity and desperation, progress and poverty, hope and horror. In the early 1990s, Ciudad Juarez was experiencing an economic boom. Hundreds of maquiladoras, foreign-owned factories, had set up operations along the border, drawn by cheap labor and proximity to the United States. Young women from all over Mexico migrated to the city, seeking work and a better life. They came from small towns in Chihuahua, from villages in Durango, from rural communities throughout central Mexico. They were daughters, sisters, mothers. They were teenagers looking for opportunity. They were women trying to support their families. The maquiladoras promised steady work, regular paychecks, a chance at independence. The young women took jobs assembling electronics, sewing clothing, manufacturing auto parts. They worked long shifts for little pay, but it was more than they could earn back home. But something dark was happening in Ciudad Juarez. Something that would turn the city into a symbol of violence against women. Something that would claim hundreds of lives and leave families searching for answers that might never come. It started with disappearances. A young woman would leave for work in the morning and never arrive. Another would leave a nightclub and vanish into the night. One more would board a bus home and never be seen again. At first, the disappearances seemed random. Isolated incidents in a city of over 1 million people. But then the bodies started appearing. In the desert surrounding Ciudad Juarez, in empty lots within the city, along the highways cutting through the dusty landscape, the bodies of young women were being discovered. Raped, tortured, murdered, discarded like trash. The victims shared certain characteristics. Most were young, between 14 and 25. Most had dark hair and slender builds. Most were poor, working-class women with few resources and no powerful connections to demand justice. And most heartbreakingly, most were forgotten almost as soon as they were found. This is the story of the femicides of Ciudad Juarez. A story of systemic violence, failed investigations, and families who refused to let their daughters be forgotten. The official count of the Ciudad Juarez femicides varies depending on who's keeping track. Some sources say the murders began in 1993. Others trace patterns of violence against women in the city back even further. But everyone agrees that by the mid-1990s, a crisis was unfolding. One of the earliest documented cases was Alma Shavira Farrell. She was 13 years old when she disappeared in January 1993. Her body was found in February in Lot Bravo, a desolate area on the outskirts of the city. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. In April 1993, 17-year-old Angelina Luna Villalobos disappeared while walking to a store. Her remains were discovered months later. The cause of death was listed as strangulation. By the end of 1993, at least 16 young women had been murdered in Ciudad Juarez. Each case shared disturbing similarities: sexual violence, extreme brutality, bodies dumped in remote locations, and investigations that went nowhere. The families of the victims tried to get authorities to pay attention. They filed reports. They organized protests. They demanded action. But the response from local police and government officials was dismissive at best, hostile at worst. Investigators suggested the victims had been involved in prostitution or drugs. They implied the women had brought violence upon themselves through risky behavior. They told grieving families that their daughters had probably run away, that they shouldn't worry, that the girls would come home. But they didn't come home. Instead, more bodies kept appearing. Esmeralda Herrera Monreal was 14 when she disappeared in October 1993. She had left home to go to a convenience store and never returned. Her mother, Ramona Monreal, immediately reported her missing, but police told her to wait. Maybe Esmeralda had a boyfriend and would come back in a few days. 2 weeks later, Esmeralda's body was found in an empty lot. She had been raped, beaten, and strangled. When Ramona demanded to know what police were doing to find her daughter's killer, she was told to stop causing problems. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Young women were being systematically targeted, brutalized, and murdered. Their bodies were being disposed of in ways meant to hide evidence and make identification difficult. And the authorities charged with protecting them were doing nothing. In 1994, the violence escalated. More disappearances, more bodies, more grieving families demanding justice that never came. 17-year-old Sylvia Elena Rivera Morales disappeared in May 1995. Her body was found 6 days later in Lot Bravo, the same area where Alma Shavira Farrell had been discovered 2 years earlier. Sylvia had been sexually assaulted and strangled, her body showing signs of extreme violence. The dumping ground in Lot Bravo was becoming a recurring location. Bodies appeared there with disturbing regularity. It was as if someone or multiple someones knew the area well and felt confident they could dispose of bodies there without being caught. And they were right. Despite the mounting death toll, despite the obvious patterns, despite the desperate pleas from families, no one was being held accountable. The femicides of Ciudad Juarez were just beginning. To understand the femicides, you have to understand the economic transformation of Ciudad Juarez. In the 1960s, Mexico established the Border Industrialization Program, allowing foreign companies to set up factories called maquiladoras near the U.S.-Mexico border. By the 1990s, Ciudad Juarez had become a maquiladora capital. Over 300 factories operated in the city, employing more than 200,000 workers. And the majority of those workers were young women. The factories preferred to hire women. They were seen as more docile, more willing to accept low wages, less likely to organize unions. Young women, often teenagers, made up the bulk of the workforce assembling televisions, sewing jeans, manufacturing car parts. These young women worked brutal shifts, often 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely covered basic expenses. They lived in colonias, impoverished neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city, where homes were little more than shacks cobbled together from scrap materials. Many of the colonias had no paved roads, no streetlights, no reliable public transportation. Women had to walk long distances in the dark to reach bus stops. They traveled through isolated areas where help was far away and danger was close. The maquiladoras created a perfect storm of vulnerability. Thousands of young women, far from their families, living in poverty, traveling through dangerous areas with no protection. And when these women started disappearing, when their bodies started appearing in the desert, the factory owners showed little concern. Some factories wouldn't even allow workers time off to search for missing friends or attend funerals. If a woman didn't show up for work, she was simply replaced. The factories needed workers, not complicated situations that might attract negative attention. Julia was 17 when she came to Ciudad Juarez from a small town in Durango. She got a job at a maquiladora assembling circuit boards for televisions. She worked the evening shift, clocking out at midnight. To get home, Julia had to walk 20 minutes through dark streets to catch a bus. The bus route took her through isolated areas. She often arrived home after 1 in the morning, exhausted and alone. Julia's mother worried constantly. She had heard the stories about women disappearing. But what choice did they have? They needed Julia's income to survive. One night in November 1995, Julia didn't come home. Her mother went to the police. The response was familiar by now. Wait 48 hours, maybe she's with a boyfriend. Young girls do this all the time. 3 days later, Julia's body was found in an empty lot not far from the bus route she took home every night. She had been raped and strangled. The police investigation lasted less than a week before the case was closed as unsolved. Julia's case was like so many others. A young maquiladora worker, isolated, vulnerable, forgotten. The connection between the maquiladoras and the femicides was undeniable. These factories had created an economic system that depended on the exploitation of young women. And now those same women were being murdered with impunity. Certain locations in and around Ciudad Juarez became synonymous with death. Empty lots, desert areas, construction sites, places where bodies were repeatedly discovered. The most notorious of these dumping grounds was Lot Bravo. Lote Bravo was an undeveloped area on the southeastern edge of Ciudad Juarez. It was essentially desert, sandy soil, sparse vegetation, no development. It was the kind of place you wouldn't go unless you had a specific reason. But someone had a reason. Between 1995 and 1996, the bodies of at least 8 young women were found in Lote Bravo. The victims showed similar patterns of violence: sexual assault, strangulation, bodies left exposed to the elements. The fact that so many bodies appeared in the same location suggested several possibilities. Either there was a serial killer using this area as his dumping ground, or multiple killers knew about Lote Bravo and were using it for the same purpose, or there was some kind of network or organization responsible for the murders. What made Lote Bravo particularly chilling was how accessible it was. It wasn't some remote wilderness. It was right on the edge of the city. Police could have easily staked out the area, monitored activity, caught someone in the act. But they didn't. Bodies kept appearing in Lote Bravo month after month, and no one was ever caught depositing them there. Another notorious location was the area around Cristo Negro, a massive statue of Christ on the outskirts of the city. In November 2001, the remains of 8 women were discovered in a cotton field near the statue. The bodies had been there for months, some for over a year. The Cristo Negro victims became one of the most high-profile cases in the femicides. The sheer number of bodies found in one location, the evidence of systematic violence, the proximity to a religious landmark, it captured international attention in a way previous discoveries hadn't. Forensic analysis of the Cristo Negro victims revealed horrifying details. The women had been held captive before being killed. They showed signs of prolonged sexual assault. Some had been beaten so severely that bones were broken. All had been strangled. The discovery of the Cristo Negro victims finally forced authorities to acknowledge what families and activists had been saying for years. This was not random violence. This was systematic. This was organized. This was femicide. But even with international pressure, even with undeniable evidence of serial murder, the investigations remained inadequate. Suspects were arrested and released. Evidence was mishandled. Families were given conflicting information about their daughters' cases. In the Arroyo El Navajo area, another cluster of bodies was found in 1996. 5 young women, all showing similar patterns of violence, all disposed of in the same general location. What the dumping grounds revealed was chilling in its implications. Whoever was responsible for these murders felt confident enough to use the same locations repeatedly. They weren't afraid of being caught. They knew the police weren't looking. They knew they could kill with impunity. And they were right. As the death toll climbed and official indifference continued, the families of victims began to organize. Mothers who had lost daughters found each other. They shared their experiences of dismissive police, bungled investigations, and victim blaming. These women refused to let their daughters be forgotten. They refused to accept that poor women's lives didn't matter. They became activists, demanding justice and accountability from a system that wanted them to stay silent. One of the most prominent voices was Ramona Morales, whose daughter Paula Gonzalez had disappeared in 2001. Paula was 17, a maquiladora worker who vanished while walking home from work. Her body was found in Lote Bravo 3 weeks later. Ramona became a founding member of Voces Sin Echo, Voices Without Echo, an organization of mothers searching for their missing daughters and demanding justice for those who had been murdered. The mothers organized marches. They held vigils outside government buildings. They created crosses, pink and black crosses bearing the names of victims, and planted them in the locations where bodies had been found. The pink and black crosses became a symbol of the femicides. They marked the empty lots, the desert dumping grounds, the places where young women's lives had been stolen. And they served as a constant reminder to Ciudad Juarez that these deaths demanded acknowledgement. Another key figure in the movement was Maricela Escobedo. Her daughter Ruby was murdered in 2008, and Maricela spent years fighting for justice. She camped outside the governor's palace in Chihuahua City, demanding that authorities investigate her daughter's case properly. In December 2010, Maricela Escobedo was shot and killed while protesting outside the governor's palace. Her murder sent shockwaves through Mexico and drew international attention to the dangers faced by those seeking justice for femicide victims. The families also reached out to international organizations, human rights groups, women's rights activists, and journalists from around the world came to Ciudad Juarez to document what was happening. These outside observers brought pressure that local authorities couldn't easily dismiss. Reports from organizations like Amnesty International and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights condemned the Mexican government's failure to protect women and investigate the murders. But even international pressure had limited effect. The murders continued, the investigations remained inadequate, and the families kept fighting against a system designed to ignore them. The mothers created databases of missing women, tracking cases that police claimed didn't exist. They pressured authorities to perform DNA testing on unidentified remains. They demanded that cases be reopened when new evidence emerged. They did the work that police should have been doing all along. And in doing so, they exposed the depth of official corruption and incompetence. The organization of victim families became crucial not just for seeking justice, but for changing the narrative. The authorities wanted to portray the victims as disposable. Prostitutes, drug users, women of loose morals who brought violence upon themselves. The families fought back against that narrative. They shared photographs of their daughters as children, as students, as workers. They told stories of dreams and ambitions cut short. They humanized victims that the system wanted to dehumanize. This was more than seeking justice for individual cases. This was fighting against a culture that considered poor women's lives expendable. Over the years, numerous theories emerged to explain the femicides of Ciudad Juarez. Some pointed to serial killers. Others suggested organized crime involvement. Still others theorized about snuff film production or organ harvesting. The truth was likely more complex than any single theory could explain. The femicides didn't have one cause or one perpetrator. They were the result of multiple factors converging in a city where violence against women was enabled by systemic failures. One early theory focused on bus drivers. Many victims had last been seen at bus stops or boarding buses. Some witnesses reported seeing women getting into buses that then disappeared. Several bus drivers were arrested and charged with murders. The most high-profile arrest came in 1995 when Sharif Sharif, an Egyptian chemist living in Ciudad Juarez, was arrested and charged with multiple murders. Prosecutors claimed Sharif was a serial killer responsible for dozens of deaths. But the case against Sharif was problematic from the start. Evidence was questionable. Confessions appeared to have been coerced. And most damning of all, women continued to be murdered in the same patterns even after Sharif was imprisoned. If Sharif was the killer, how were women still dying in the same way while he sat in prison? The authorities had no good answer. Some suggested Sharif had inspired copycat killers. Others claimed there were multiple killers and Sharif was just one of them. Another theory pointed to Los Rebeldes, the rebels, a gang allegedly responsible for some of the murders. Several gang members were arrested, but again, the murders continued even after these arrests. The pattern repeated itself over and over. Authorities would arrest suspects, claim they had solved the cases, hold press conferences declaring victory. Then more bodies would appear, and the official story would quietly shift. Some investigators and activists believed the murders were connected to organized crime, specifically drug trafficking organizations that controlled much of Ciudad Juarez. The cartels had the resources, the territory, and the impunity to commit crimes without fear of consequences. There were reports of young women being forced into prostitution by drug trafficking organizations. Others were allegedly murdered when they witnessed cartel activities. Some theories suggested the murders were a form of social cleansing, eliminating people the cartels considered disposable. Another disturbing theory involved snuff films, videos of actual murders sold on the black market. Some witnesses claimed to have seen videos of women being killed. Others reported being approached by people offering large sums of money to participate in or witness violent acts. While evidence for the snuff film theory remained largely anecdotal, It persisted because it explained certain aspects of the crimes. The extreme violence, the systematic nature of the assaults, the sense that victims were being tortured for someone's entertainment. There were also theories about powerful individuals, politicians, businessmen, cartel leaders, who murdered with impunity because they knew they were protected. These theories suggested that some victims had been specifically targeted, perhaps because they knew too much or had refused advances from powerful men. What became clear through all the theories and arrested suspects was this: the authorities didn't know who was responsible. Or if they did know, they were protecting the killers. The investigations were so poorly conducted that even when suspects were identified, prosecutions fell apart. Evidence was contaminated. Chain of custody was broken. Confessions were obtained through torture. In some cases, suspects were clearly innocent but were prosecuted anyway to show that authorities were doing something. In other cases, obvious suspects were never seriously investigated because they had political connections or cartel ties. The families of victims watched as suspect. After suspect was paraded before the media, only to see cases collapse or murders continue. They lost faith that the truth would ever be known. Before we continue deeper into this tragedy, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? This case involves women from all walks of life, and I'm curious to know where in the world you are as we explore this important story together. Please take a moment to drop a comment with your location. By the late 1990s, the femicides of Ciudad Juarez had captured international attention. Human rights organizations, journalists, and filmmakers from around the world descended on the border city to document the crisis. In 1998, Amnesty International published a report titled Mexico: Killings and Abductions of Women in Ciudad Juarez and the City of Chihuahua. The report condemned the Mexican government's failure to protect women and investigate the murders adequately. The United Nations sent special rapporteurs to investigate. Their reports were damning, describing a pattern of gender-based violence enabled by official indifference and corruption. The Washington Office on Latin America, Human Rights Watch, and numerous other international organizations published reports echoing the same conclusions. Women in Ciudad Juarez were being murdered systematically, and the Mexican government was failing in its duty to protect them. The international pressure forced Mexican officials to respond. They created special prosecutor offices dedicated to investigating the femicides. They allocated resources. They made promises of reform. But promises and press conferences didn't translate into results. The special prosecutor offices were understaffed and underfunded. Investigators lacked basic training in handling sexual assault and homicide cases. Evidence continued to be mishandled or lost. In 2003, the film Señorita Extraviada, Missing Young Woman, premiered, documenting the femicides and the fight for justice. The documentary brought the crisis to film festivals around the world, generating widespread awareness. Books were written about Ciudad Juarez. The Daughters of Juarez by Teresa Rodriguez became an international bestseller. Harvest of Women by Diana Washington Valdez provided detailed investigative reporting on the murders. Artists created works responding to the violence. The pink crosses became symbols reproduced in paintings, sculptures, and installations worldwide. Musicians wrote songs about the victims. Poets dedicated verses to the forgotten women of Juarez. But for all the international attention, for all the reports and documentaries and artistic tributes, the fundamental situation in Ciudad Juarez didn't change. Women continued to disappear. Bodies continued to appear. Families continued to search for justice. Some activists argued that international attention actually made things worse. The Mexican government became defensive, more concerned with managing its image than addressing the underlying problems. Officials spent energy denying the scope of the crisis rather than solving it. There was also tension about outsiders telling Ciudad Juarez's story. Some felt that international journalists and filmmakers were exploiting the victims, using their suffering to advance careers or sell books. Others argued that any attention was good attention because it kept pressure on authorities. The mothers of victims had mixed feelings about international observers. They appreciated the support and the validation that their fight mattered. But they also resented that it took international pressure to make their government even pretend to care about dead Mexican women. What the international attention did accomplish was preventing the femicides from being completely forgotten. The pink crosses, the names of victims, the faces of grieving mothers, these became known worldwide. Ciudad Juarez became synonymous with femicide, a dark example of what happens when violence against women goes unchecked. But awareness alone doesn't stop murders. And as the world watched and documented and protested, the women of Ciudad Juarez continued to die. Understanding the femicides requires understanding the culture of corruption that permeated every level of government and law enforcement in Ciudad Juarez. This wasn't just incompetence. This was willful negligence enabled by a system where money and power trumped justice. Police officers in Ciudad Juarez were notoriously corrupt. Many were on the payroll of drug cartels. Others supplemented meager salaries by extorting businesses or accepting bribes. The idea that these same officers would diligently investigate murders of poor women was laughable. There were credible allegations that some police officers were directly involved in the femicides. Witnesses reported seeing police vehicles in areas where bodies were later found. Some victims had last been seen talking to men in police uniforms. But investigating police required an internal affairs system that functioned. In Ciudad Juarez, that system was virtually non-existent. Officers protected each other. Complaints disappeared. Witnesses were intimidated into silence. The corruption extended to prosecutors and judges. Cases that should have gone to trial never made it past preliminary hearings. Evidence that should have led to convictions mysteriously disappeared. Judges who should have demanded accountability instead accepted shoddy police work without question. In some cases, families were told they had to pay bribes to get investigations started. Others were charged fees to retrieve their daughters' bodies from the morgue. The system found ways to profit even from grief and desperation. There were also allegations of political involvement in covering up the femicides. Some theories suggested that powerful politicians had either participated in the murders or were protecting those who did. Others pointed to corruption so deep that officials had financial incentives to keep investigations from succeeding. The culture of impunity was complete. Murderers knew they could kill without consequence. Police knew they could ignore crimes without punishment. Politicians knew they could make empty promises without accountability. This corruption wasn't unique to Ciudad Juarez. It was endemic throughout Mexico, particularly in areas controlled by drug cartels. But in Ciudad Juarez, the corruption enabled a specific kind of violence: the systematic murder of vulnerable women. One particularly egregious example of corruption involved the mishandling of DNA evidence. Families had been demanding DNA testing to identify remains and potentially connect cases. But the testing was rarely done, and when it was, the results were unreliable. There were cases where families were told remains belonged to their daughters, only to later discover through independent testing that the identification was wrong. Other families were given different body parts claimed to belong to the same victim, only to find through DNA testing that they came from different people. The DNA debacle revealed either staggering incompetence or deliberate sabotage of investigations. Either way, it showed that families couldn't trust basic forensic processes that should have been straightforward. Journalists who investigated too deeply faced threats and violence. Several reporters working on femicide stories received death threats. Some were physically attacked. Others fled Ciudad Juarez after being warned they would be killed if they continued reporting. The message was clear: asking questions about the femicides was dangerous. Demanding accountability could get you killed. The system wanted silence, and it was willing to use violence to maintain it. In November 2001, the discovery of 8 bodies in a cotton field near Cristo Negro became a turning point. The sheer number of victims found in one location, the evidence of systematic torture, and the international attention that followed made the case impossible for authorities to ignore completely. The victims were young women who had disappeared over the previous year. They had been held captive, sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered. Their bodies had been dumped in the cotton field where they decomposed for months before being discovered. One of the victims was Claudia Yvette Gonzalez, a 20-year-old maquiladora worker. She had disappeared in October 2001 while waiting for a bus after work. Her mother, Irma Monreal, immediately reported her missing, but police did nothing. When Claudia's body was found in the cotton field, Irma demanded answers. How could 8 women disappear and be murdered without police noticing? How could their bodies lie in a field for months without being discovered? Who was responsible? The answers she got were infuriating. Police claimed they had suspects. They arrested 2 bus drivers, Victor Garcia and Gustavo Gonzalez, and charged them with some of the murders. But the case against them fell apart almost immediately. The supposed confessions had been obtained through torture. The evidence was circumstantial at best. And critically, there was no explanation for how 2 bus drivers could have held multiple women captive, tortured them, and disposed of their bodies without anyone noticing. The families of the cotton field victims refused to accept the official story. They organized, hiring lawyers and forensic experts to review the cases. What they discovered was shocking even by Ciudad Juarez standards. Evidence had been mishandled from the start. The crime scene had been contaminated, with police allowing unauthorized people to walk through the area where bodies were found. Chain of custody on crucial evidence had been broken, making it inadmissible in court. Autopsies had been performed poorly, missing obvious evidence and making errors that a competent medical examiner would never make. Bodies had been released to wrong families, requiring exhumations and re-identifications. The Cotton Field case became a symbol of everything wrong with the femicide investigations. Authorities had been given the perfect opportunity to show they took these murders seriously. Instead, they demonstrated once again their incompetence and corruption. Frustrated by the lack of justice in Mexico, the families of 3 cotton field victims, Claudia Yvette Gonzalez, Esmeralda Herrera, and Laura Berenice Ramos, took their case to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. In 2009, the court ruled against Mexico, finding that the government had violated the victims' rights to life, personal integrity, and access to justice. The court ordered Mexico to investigate the murders properly, prosecute those responsible, and provide reparations to the families. It was a landmark decision. For the first time, an international court had ruled that Mexico was responsible for the femicides and must be held accountable. The ruling should have been a turning point. But compliance with the court's orders was minimal. Some financial reparations were paid to families. Some symbolic gestures were made. But the fundamental failures that enabled the femicides continued. The Cotton Field case showed that even with international legal victories, even with undeniable evidence of government failure, change was slow and incomplete. The system protected itself rather than the women it was supposed to serve. For every body found in Ciudad Juarez, there were women who simply vanished. Hundreds of disappearances where no remains were ever discovered. Families left in limbo, never knowing if their daughter was dead or alive, unable to mourn or move forward. The official count of missing women varied wildly depending on the source. Some databases listed hundreds of unresolved disappearances. Others claimed the number was much lower. The lack of consistent record-keeping made it impossible to know the true scope. Many families didn't report their daughters missing because they had no faith in police. They knew from other cases that reporting a disappearance often led to victim blaming and inaction. Some feared that contacting authorities would put them in danger. When disappearances were reported, police responses were predictable. They told families to wait. They suggested the missing woman had run away or left voluntarily. They implied the family was overreacting. But the families knew their daughters. They knew the difference between a young woman choosing to leave and a young woman being taken. They knew something was wrong. Maria Sagrario Gonzalez Flores disappeared in April 1998. She was 17, a maquiladora worker who left her house one morning and never arrived at work. Her mother, Paula Flores, reported her missing immediately. Police told Paula that Maria had probably run off with a boyfriend. They refused to investigate. Paula spent weeks searching for her daughter, showing her photo to anyone who would look, following every possible lead. Maria's body was never found. Paula is still searching more than 2 decades later. She is still demanding that police investigate. She is still hoping for answers that may never come. The missing women existed in a terrible limbo. Legally, without a body, they couldn't be declared dead. But everyone knew they weren't coming home. Families couldn't have funerals, couldn't collect any benefits, couldn't achieve any kind of closure. Some families spent their life savings searching. They hired private investigators. They traveled to other cities following rumors. They consulted psychics and searched remote areas themselves, hoping to find remains that would at least give them certainty. The psychological toll was immense. Parents aged rapidly under the weight of not knowing. Siblings struggled with survivor's guilt. Families fractured under the strain of endless uncertainty and fruitless searching. There were support groups for families of the disappeared. They met regularly, sharing information and providing emotional support. But these gatherings were bittersweet, bonding over a shared tragedy that never ended. Some families believed their daughters had been trafficked, forced into prostitution, or taken across the border. There were reports of women being held in houses and forced to work as sex slaves. But without evidence, without investigations, these remained just theories. Others feared their daughters had been killed, but their bodies disposed of in ways that made discovery unlikely. Dissolved in acid, buried in remote desert locations, thrown into the Rio Grande. The disappearances were in some ways worse than the discovered bodies. At least families who found their daughters could bury them, could have a place to mourn, could begin some kind of healing process. But the families of the disappeared existed in permanent suspension. Every day brought the hope that today might bring news. Every knock on the door might be their daughter returning. Every phone call might be the answer they sought. And every day that passed without answers made hope a little harder to maintain. As families organized and international attention grew, local activists emerged as crucial voices demanding justice and accountability. These activists risked their lives to document the femicides, support victim families, and pressure authorities to act. Esther Chavez Cano was one of the first and most important activists. A retired accountant, Esther founded Casa Amiga in 1999, the first crisis center in Ciudad Juarez for victims of sexual violence and domestic abuse. She became a fierce advocate for the murdered and missing women. Esther meticulously documented cases, creating databases when authorities wouldn't. She tracked patterns the police ignored. She gave interviews to international media, ensuring the femicides remained in the public eye. She worked until her death in 2009, never seeing the justice she fought for. Another crucial activist was Maricela Ortiz, a professor at the Autonomous University of Ciudad Juarez. Maricela co-founded Nuestros Hijos de Regreso a Casa, May Our Daughters Return Home, in 2001. The organization provided support to victim families and pushed for investigations. Maricela and her colleagues faced constant threats. Anonymous callers told them to stop their work or they would be killed. They received death threats in writing and online. Despite the danger, they continued organizing marches, documenting cases, and demanding accountability. The Pink Cross became the symbol of the activist movement. Simple wooden crosses painted pink with black lettering, bearing the names and ages of victims. Activists planted these crosses at sites where bodies had been found, creating visible memorials that couldn't be ignored. Authorities sometimes removed the crosses, claiming they were unauthorized installations. Activists would return and plant them again. This cycle repeated endlessly, a small act of resistance against official erasure. Activists also worked to change the narrative around the victims. They organized exhibitions featuring photographs and belongings of the murdered women. They held poetry readings and concerts. They created art installations that forced people to confront the humanity of the victims. One powerful project was the creation of life-size cloth dolls representing victims. Each doll was handmade, dressed in clothing similar to what the victim had worn when she disappeared. The dolls were displayed in public spaces, forcing passers-by to see and remember. These memorial projects served multiple purposes. They honored the victims and kept their memories alive. They educated the public about the scope of the violence, and they maintained pressure on authorities who wanted the cases forgotten. Activists also worked with journalists to investigate cases authorities ignored. They gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and helped piece together what had happened to specific victims. In many cases, activist investigations were more thorough than official police work. But activism came at a cost. Several activists received death threats serious enough that they had to go into hiding. Some left Ciudad Juarez entirely, continuing their work from exile. Others stayed despite the risks, believing someone had to bear witness. The constant stress took a toll on activists' health and personal lives. Marriages ended under the strain. Mental health suffered from the trauma of constantly engaging with horrific violence. Financial stability was sacrificed as activists devoted time and resources to their work. Yet they continued, because someone had to fight for the women nobody else cared about. Someone had to document the crimes nobody else would investigate. Someone had to ensure these murders didn't disappear into official silence. To fully understand the femicides of Ciudad Juarez, you must understand the context of Mexico's drug war. While the murders of women began in the early 1990s, they intensified and evolved as cartel violence consumed the city. In 2006, Mexican President Felipe Calderón launched a military offensive against drug trafficking organizations. The result was an explosion of violence throughout Mexico, with Ciudad Juarez becoming one of the deadliest cities on earth. By 2010, Ciudad Juarez was experiencing over 3,000 murders per year. Bodies appeared daily in the streets. Public executions became common. The city was essentially a war zone. In this context of generalized violence, the femicides became easier to hide. What made Ciudad Juarez different in the 1990s, a pattern of murdered women, became just another form of violence in a city drowning in blood. The cartels fighting for control of Ciudad Juarez, primarily the Juarez cartel and the Sinaloa cartel, were responsible for much of the violence. But they were also likely responsible for some of the femicides, either directly or indirectly. There were documented cases of women being murdered because they witnessed cartel activities. Others were killed when they refused to work for the cartels as informants or drug couriers. Some were murdered simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The cartels also controlled much of the sex trafficking in Ciudad Juarez. Women and girls were forced into prostitution, held in houses controlled by cartel members. Those who tried to escape or refused to comply were killed. Some investigators believed that cartel members were directly responsible for many of the femicides. The patterns of torture, the dumping of bodies, the confidence of the killers, all suggested people who were accustomed to violence and knew they could act with impunity. The drug war also made investigations impossible. Police were overwhelmed with murders. Resources were diverted to combating cartels. Cases that might have been prioritized in calmer times were ignored because there were simply too many deaths to investigate. Moreover, the corruption that had always plagued Ciudad Juarez intensified during the drug war. Police and officials were either working for cartels or too frightened to investigate cartel activities. This created a climate where any murder could be committed without consequence. The cartels also targeted journalists and activists, making it dangerous to speak about any crime, including the femicides. Several journalists covering the drug war were murdered. Others went into exile. The free press that might have kept pressure on authorities was silenced through violence. For victim families, the drug war made their fight even harder. Their demands for justice were lost in the chaos. Officials claimed they were too busy dealing with the cartel war to focus on old cases. The femicides became just another category of unsolved murders in a city full of them. But the drug war also revealed something important. The violence against women in Ciudad Juarez wasn't separate from the broader culture of violence. It was part of it. The same failures that allowed cartels to operate with impunity allowed femicides to continue unchecked. The connection between organized crime and violence against women highlighted a fundamental truth. Where powerful men can commit crimes without consequence, all crimes become easier. The femicides thrived in a culture where violence was normalized and justice was negotiable. Behind every statistic was a person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman with dreams and plans and people who loved her. Remembering the victims as individuals, not just numbers, was crucial to the fight for justice. Lilia Alejandra Garcia Andrade was 17 when she disappeared in February 2001. She worked at a maquiladora and was studying in the evenings to finish her education. She wanted to become a lawyer, believing she could help make Mexico more just. Lilia left work one evening and never made it home. Her family searched desperately. 5 days later, her body was found in an empty lot. She had been raped and beaten to death. Her case remains unsolved. Lilia's mother keeps her bedroom exactly as she left it. The books she was reading for school, the posters on her walls, the clothes in her closet. It's become a shrine to a life cut short and dreams that will never be fulfilled. Brenda Berenice Castillo Garcia was 15 when she disappeared in June 2002. She was walking to a friend's house, a trip that should have taken 10 minutes. She never arrived. Brenda's body was found 6 months later in Lot Bravo, the desert dumping ground that had become synonymous with femicide. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her family had spent those 6 months searching, hoping, praying she would come home alive. Brenda's younger sister later said she stopped playing in their neighborhood. She stopped going out alone. She lived in constant fear of meeting the same fate. The femicides didn't just kill their direct victims, they traumatized entire communities. Merida Pena was 21, a single mother working at a maquiladora to support her young daughter. She disappeared in May 2003 while walking home from work. Her body was never found. Merida's daughter grew up without her mother, raised by Merida's parents who were also caring for 2 other grandchildren orphaned by the violence. The economic and emotional burden was crushing, but they had no choice. This was the reality for many families in Ciudad Juarez. Guadalupe Luna de la Rosa was 14 when she was murdered in 1995. She was one of the earliest documented victims. Her mother spent decades fighting for justice, attending every march, every protest, every memorial service. Guadalupe's mother died in 2015 without ever seeing anyone held accountable for her daughter's murder. She spent the last 20 years of her life seeking justice that never came. This was the cruel reality for many families. They died without answers. Each victim had a story. Each had a family that loved them. Each had plans and dreams and futures that were stolen. The tendency to see the femicides as statistics, 300 dead for 100, 500 depending on who was counting, obscured the individual tragedies. The families worked to keep their daughters' identities alive. They created memory books. They organized anniversary gatherings. They spoke their daughters' names at every opportunity, refusing to let them be forgotten. Some families created small memorials in their homes, photographs, candles, flowers, places to remember and mourn. These private shrines were all they had since many victims never received proper burials or their bodies were never found. The activist organizations documented not just the circumstances of the murders, but the lives the victims had lived, who they were as people, their personalities, their hopes, their relationships. This humanization was crucial work, because if the victims were just numbers, just names on a list, it was easy for officials to dismiss them. But when you knew that Lilia wanted to be a lawyer, that Brenda loved music, that Merida worked to support her daughter, they became real. Their deaths became impossible to ignore. The victims of Ciudad Juarez deserved to be remembered not just for how they died, but for how they lived. The fight for justice took place not just in the streets, but in courtrooms. Families and activists pursued legal strategies to force accountability and reform. Some cases made it to the highest levels of international justice. The most significant legal victory was the 2009 ruling by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the Cotton Field case. The court found Mexico responsible for failing to protect the victims, failing to investigate properly, and denying justice to the families. The ruling ordered Mexico to conduct effective investigations into the murders, identify and prosecute those responsible, provide reparations to victim families, Implement reforms to prevent future violence. Create a monument honoring the victims. Mexico accepted the ruling, but implementation was slow and incomplete. Some reparations were paid. A monument was eventually erected. But the crucial reforms, improved investigations, police training, prosecution of suspects, largely didn't happen. In 2007, Mexico passed the General Law on Women's Access to a Life Free from Violence. The law was supposed to provide federal resources and oversight for cases of gender-based violence. It created mechanisms for declaring gender violence alerts in areas where femicides were occurring. But the law had limited practical impact in Ciudad Juarez. The mechanisms for declaring alerts were complex and politically fraught. Local officials resisted federal intervention. Resources promised under the law often failed to materialize. There were also legislative efforts at the state level. Chihuahua State passed laws specifically addressing femicide, making it a distinct crime with enhanced penalties. The laws required specialized training for police and prosecutors handling gender-based violence cases. Again, implementation lagged behind legislation. Training programs were underfunded. Specialized units were understaffed. The gap between law on paper and law in practice remained vast. Families pursued individual legal cases with mixed results. Some cases led to convictions, though often of low-level participants, while those who ordered or organized the murders remained free. Other cases stalled in bureaucratic delays that stretched for years. The legal system itself was part of the problem. Corruption, incompetence, and indifference permeated every level. Judges who should have demanded accountability instead accepted inadequate investigations. Prosecutors who should have built strong cases instead did minimal work. There were also issues with how evidence was handled in court. Defense attorneys successfully challenged evidence that had been improperly collected or stored. Confessions obtained through torture were inadmissible. The bungled investigations that failed to deliver justice initially continued to obstruct justice later. Some families won civil judgments against the Mexican government, receiving financial compensation for their losses. But most families said no amount of money could make up for their daughters. What they wanted was justice, someone held accountable, someone imprisoned for the murders. International pressure led to some changes. Mexico allowed international observers into investigations. Some cases received technical assistance from foreign forensic experts. But these measures were sporadic and limited in scope. The fundamental problem remained. The political will to truly address the femicides was absent. Officials made promises when pressure was high, then quietly abandoned reforms when attention moved elsewhere. Legal victories were important symbolically and provided some measure of validation for families. But they didn't bring back the dead or significantly reduce the violence against women in Ciudad Juarez. Understanding the femicides requires understanding the broader cultural context of machismo and violence against women in Mexico. The murders in Ciudad Juarez were an extreme manifestation of attitudes and behaviors that existed throughout Mexican society. Machismo, the cultural emphasis on male dominance and female subordination, shaped how violence against women was perceived and addressed. Women were often blamed for violence committed against them. They should have dressed differently, behaved differently, been more careful. This victim blaming was evident in how authorities discussed the femicide victims. They emphasized that victims had been out late at night, had worked in bars or nightclubs, had associated with the wrong people. The implication was always that the victims shared responsibility for their own murders. Domestic violence was endemic in Mexico, often dismissed as a private matter that authorities shouldn't interfere with. The phrase "site pega, es porque te quiere," if he hits you, it's because he loves you, reflected dangerous cultural attitudes about male violence. These attitudes created a climate where violence against women was normalized. If a husband beating his wife was acceptable, if women being harassed on the street was expected, then the leap to femicide was smaller than it should have been. The economic exploitation of women in the maquiladoras was another form of violence. Young women worked in dangerous conditions for poverty wages. Sexual harassment by supervisors was common. The factories treated workers as disposable, replaceable units of production. This economic violence created vulnerable populations, women who were poor, isolated, exhausted from long work hours, traveling through dangerous areas. They were easy targets for predators. The sexualization of violence was also a factor. Some of the murders showed evidence of sexual torture, victims who had been brutalized in ways designed to inflict maximum suffering. This suggested killers who derived pleasure from harming women, who saw female pain as entertainment. There was also the issue of how women's bodies were discussed and displayed. The media coverage of the femicides often included graphic details of sexual assault and mutilation. This sensationalization reflected and reinforced the objectification of women's bodies. The Catholic Church, a powerful cultural force in Mexico, had a complex relationship with the femicides. Some Catholic leaders spoke out against the violence. Others maintained silence. The Church's traditional teachings about women's roles and sexuality sometimes reinforced the machismo that enabled violence. Education about gender equality and women's rights was limited in Ciudad Juarez. Young people grew up absorbing cultural messages about male dominance and female submission. Challenging these messages required systemic educational reform that never materialized. The normalization of violence in Ciudad Juarez also played a role. In a city where bodies appeared in the streets regularly due to cartel warfare, where violence was part of daily life, the femicides could be dismissed as just another type of violence in a violent place. But activists argued that the femicides were different. They were targeted, systematic, based specifically on the victim's gender. This wasn't random violence. It was gender-based violence rooted in the devaluation of women's lives. Changing culture is harder than changing laws. You can mandate training and create oversight mechanisms, but you can't legislate away deeply held beliefs about gender and power. The fight against the femicides was therefore also a fight against cultural attitudes that made such violence possible. It required not just catching killers, but transforming how society valued women's lives. If you've stayed with this story to this point, I want to hear from you again. Where are you and what time is it where you are? This is a difficult case to follow, but an important one. Please take a moment to share your location and thoughts in the comments. More than 3 decades after the femicides began, the crisis in Ciudad Juarez continues. The violence has evolved, the specific patterns have changed, but women are still being murdered and justice is still elusive. According to various sources, between 1993 and 2020, anywhere from 1,500 to over 3,000 women were murdered in Ciudad Juarez. The wide range in estimates reflects the lack of consistent record-keeping and disagreements about which deaths should be classified as femicides. Some improvements have been made. There is greater awareness of gender-based violence. Activist organizations are more established and have more resources. International attention provides ongoing pressure for accountability. But the fundamental problems persist. Women continue to disappear. Bodies continue to be found. Investigations continue to fail. Families continue to search for justice that remains out of reach. The drug war violence that peaked around 2010 has somewhat subsided, but Ciudad Juarez remains dangerous. The cartels still control much of the city. Corruption still pervades law enforcement and government. The culture of impunity remains intact. In 2020, Mexico recorded 3,752 femicides nationwide. That's more than 10 women murdered every day because of their gender. Ciudad Juarez and Chihuahua State continue to have some of the highest rates of violence against women in Mexico. The COVID-19 pandemic made the situation worse. Lockdowns trapped women in homes with abusive partners. Economic stress increased domestic violence. Resources for victim support were diverted to pandemic response. There were reports of increased disappearances during the pandemic. Women who might have been noticed missing when they didn't show up to work were lost in the chaos of lockdowns and economic disruption. Their disappearances might not be discovered for months or years. The activist organizations continue their work despite limited resources and ongoing threats. They document cases, support families, organize protests, and maintain pressure on authorities. but they're fighting against systemic failures that show no signs of genuine reform. New generations of families join the fight as new victims are claimed. Mothers who lost daughters in the 1990s now stand alongside mothers who lost daughters last year. The grief is fresh for new families even as it has become chronic for old ones. Some victims from the early years of the femicides have never been identified. Their remains sit in morgues or have been buried in unmarked graves. Their families may still be searching, not knowing that their daughter's body was found years ago. The pink crosses continue to appear at murder sites. New ones are added regularly. They've become a permanent part of Ciudad Juarez's landscape, a constant reminder of violence that never truly ended. There have been some prosecutions in recent years. Some cases that were cold for decades have been reopened. DNA technology has allowed for identification of remains that couldn't be identified when they were first discovered. But for every case that sees progress, there are dozens more that remain unsolved. For every family that gets some measure of closure, there are many more still searching. The femicides of Ciudad Juarez haven't ended. They've evolved. The specific patterns may have changed. The volume of media attention has decreased. But the fundamental reality, that women in Ciudad Juarez are murdered and their killers face no consequences, remains unchanged. This isn't a historical tragedy that can be reflected on from a safe distance. This is an ongoing crisis. Women are dying right now in Ciudad Juarez. Families are searching right now. The fight for justice continues right now. The femicides didn't just claim the lives of those who were murdered. They impacted entire communities, creating trauma that rippled across generations. Understanding this broader impact is crucial to understanding the full scope of the tragedy. Sisters of victims lived in constant fear. If their sister could be taken, so could they. Many changed their entire lives, avoiding certain areas, never going out alone, constantly looking over their shoulders. They carried survivor's guilt, wondering why they had been spared when their sister hadn't. Brothers often felt helpless rage. They had been unable to protect their sisters. Some joined the search efforts, some became activists, some channeled their pain into violence of their own. The trauma manifested in different ways for different people. Mothers bore perhaps the heaviest burden. They blamed themselves for not preventing their daughter's murders. They tortured themselves with what-ifs. What if they had driven their daughter to work that day? What if they had convinced her to stay home? What if they had moved to a different city? The psychological toll was immense. Depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress. These were common among victim families. Many couldn't afford therapy or mental health treatment. They carried their trauma alone, supported only by each other. There was also economic impact. Families spent their savings searching for missing daughters or pursuing legal cases. They lost income when they took time off work to attend court hearings or protests. Some went into debt trying to get justice. Children who lost their mothers faced particular hardships. They were often raised by grandparents who were already elderly and had limited resources. Stay tuned for the concluding part of the story in our next video, episode 116.